to EMR 504, Socioculture Factors in Literacy. I'm really excited about this course. My name is Dr. Beth Walsh-Moorman. I'll be instructor through this course. A little bit about me. I have received my doctorate from Kent State University in curriculum and instruction with a literacy specialization. And I spent 20-some years in the high school classroom teaching English language arts. And I have to tell you that this is by far to me, the most important aspect of literacy, my favorite course to teach, because it's that, there's an art and a science to teaching, and this is all about that art of teaching. It's all about the importance of knowing our students, knowing their background, being able to identify, what they can bring to the classroom so that we can build off of them and see those as strengths, okay? So today's goals, we're going to be moving to this idea of culturally responsive pedagogy, which comes into the area of social learning. But in order for us to understand what social learning is, I think we kind of really have to get like a fast review of sort of the major psychology movements that kind of framed this. And so then we're going to end with this idea of social learning theory that really will be the sort of foundational theory on which the class is predicated. All right, so really up until the 20th century, psychology was really, it looked at what our learning as. Learning was not front and center, it was our actions that were front and center. And so under behaviorism, there was this belief that if we act a certain way, we can begin to think a certain way. And so there was an emphasis on the action. And so many of you have probably seen like this image of Skinner's box, P.F. Skinner's box, and you've probably heard some of these terms before, but behaviorism believes that we can modify, that if we modify the way somebody acts, we can then start to get them ready to learn. And so under behaviorism, there's three types of responses or consequences to actions. First is positive reinforcement. You do the right action, you get a positive action. And so positive reinforcement would be, in the classroom, it'd be like, okay, for every time you get a correct answer, you get $5, okay? Negative reinforcement means that once you stop, or once you do the right action, some negative consequence will stop. And so if I don't complete my assignment, you have to pay $5. So you complete the assignment to avoid the payment. So it's more of an avoidance. Often negative reinforcement gets confused with punishment. Even I sometimes confuse it. But punishment is when you get the consequence comes as a behavior of your poor action, of your negative behavior. So the action sort of and the difference between the negative reinforcement and the punishment is the negative reinforcement, the right action stops the negative consequences. Punishment, the incorrect action, is what causes the negative consequence. Now, what was sort of obvious to people by the time the 20th century rolled around is that there were some real gaps in behaviorism because it really didn't take into account sort of our cognitive factors in learning, and it didn't look at social aspects of learning. We know that we learn simply by watching others, and if behaviorism was completely and strictly true, we could never do anything without engaging in that activity ourselves, but we know that we often learn through watching others. And so behaviorism kind of gave way to the 20th century and Freud was a big component of this, but behaviorism sort of gave way to this idea here of cognitive psychology. And under cognitive psychology, what we have is, we start to see psychology as looking at a broad range of our thinking processes, of our awareness. And so these are some, like this little diagram just explains some of the areas that you see cognitive psychologists looking at today. So this is really our notion of psychology today is probably really rooted in the cognitive tradition. And probably one of the most important people to emerge early in the cognitive tradition was Piaget, who wanted to look at how does our thinking develop over time. And so Piaget developed this idea of a developmental theory where we need to move through these stages of development, and you have to go through the sensor motor before you go into the pre-operational. You have to go through the pre-operation before you concrete, and then from the concrete you go to the formal. And really what this is it moves from where it's all about our senses. It moves us more into it's a continuum that moves us down to the theoretical and the abstract thinking that is part of the formal operations. And if you notice, you really don't get into the formal operations where you're not really able to fully reason things until you're 11, around the age 11. And so that's kind of important. But what each stage in Piaget's theory sort of is rooted in is that a child's interaction with the world around them is what causes that child to begin to learn. And so for the sensor motor, it's those physical needs, and then it is the pleasures that they start to notice and want. And so language and sort of our cognitive skills develop out of a need to categorize and catalog the world, and our need to be able to demonstrate what we want. By the time the child goes into 2 and 7, they start to develop this ability to have imagination, to be able to talk about intuition. They like people, they don't like people. They're kind of really starting to be able to come into some ideas of abstraction, but they're very, very limited in that. By 7 to 11, they start to be able to think about abstractions, but every abstraction has to be rooted in some kind of concrete example. And so in this, like for instance, the concept of family love, that their own experiences with family would be what shapes that. And then as they start to read or get to know people who have different types of family structures, then they can start to develop these concepts, but they need that concrete example first. It's not until we are in around 5th, 6th grade that we start to really be able to think about abstract logic and reasoning, become able to become more flexible, like a concept that we learn in one context, be able to apply it. So Piaget really, some of the really important ideas that Piaget came up with, and that most of us probably know if we at all know about constructivism, is this idea of schemas or schemata. We have ways that we organize concepts, and he calls those schemas. And what he says is we really, when we present new information to somebody, they have a schema. So for instance, that idea of family. They have an idea of family. They have a concept, an organized concept of what a family is. We naturally desire equilibrium. We want to be able, so we want the new information to connect with and relate to the schema that we bring in. So if we get new information that creates disequilibrium, for instance, I'm coming from a traditional family, and I believe a family means a mother, a father, and their children. And then I read a book or meet another family where maybe it's a single parent home. All of a sudden, there's this disequilibrium. My concept is no longer reflected in this new information. And so there's two things that somebody does in this new situation to be able to bring our things back into equilibrium. The first one would be to assimilate the new knowledge with our old knowledge. And so, well, they're both families, they're both parents. So now I'm going to say a family needs to have a parent. But I could also move to some things can be accommodated, assimilated, but other things need to be accommodated, which means I have to make room I need to reconstruct my schema in a pretty significant way. So I need to change my schemata and accommodate, open it up. And so obviously as you move through the stages of development, you became more open and flexible in your thinking so that you're able to make more assimilations. I liked this idea, this quote from Piaget, mostly because of what he says about knowledge. I find myself opposed to the view of knowledge as a passive copy of reality. I believe that knowing an object means acting upon it, constructing systems of transformation that can be carried out within this object. Knowing reality means constructing systems of transformations that correspond more or less adequately to reality. I really like this. I'm a constructivist myself. I think most of us probably are to some extent. And I really like this because knowledge is not a passive thing. If you think about it, behaviorists, we're very passive in our acquisition of knowledge if we believed in the behaviorist. We are acted upon, we accept the consequences, and that's what shapes our thinking. Instead, Piaget says, no, we have to interact with the world, and it's that interaction with the world that kind of develops our new knowledge. So around the same time, but really not nearly as well known during his lifetime, a psychologist, Lev Vygotsky, he was his career first began during communist revolution Russia, and then after post revolution Soviet Union is when he did a lot of his work. I will say he died very young. I think he was 38 or 39. And because of sort of the cloistered nature of the Soviet Union at that time, his theories and his work was not widely known in the Western world. But what Lev Vygotsky believed was that learning was a social practice, and I don't think it's a coincidence that he comes out of this communist revolution where there is this idea of fraternity, of shared expectations. You know, you think about the communal. And what he thought was that knowledge is something that we gain through our connections and our actions with other people. So knowledge is rooted in social interaction. So you probably do know Lev Vygotsky for his idea of the zone of proximal development. It's probably something that you learned about in undergrad. And what the ZPD really talks about is that we can learn from somebody who is more skilled than us. And this is kind of the basis for scaffolding and the theories of scaffolding that we have in today's classrooms. And so that we function often as the more knowledgeable other in the classroom, but certainly if you do purposeful grouping, you might have one peer who's more knowledgeable than the other, reciprocal teaching, things like that. And the other thing that Vygotsky is known for is this idea or the starting to connect language and thinking. And so for Vygotsky, he really looked at language as something very different than our thought. These were not the same thing, but they were related. And so he talked about thought as inner speech, but he thought that inner speech developed from external speech. And so this is really important. He really began to see, so he really is important in these early ideas of literacy. Vygotsky really became known to us through Jerome Bruner, who kind of extended Vygotsky's theories. And he looked specifically at the role of language and thinking. And he really thought that language was a complex thinking tool that is shaped by our social interaction and passed down by adults and internalized by children. So he too had this like developmental idea. So the first kind, so we represent our knowledge in different ways. The first way, when we're children, when we're infants, through just action. So physical, sort of, they think about how we say, that we have muscle memory. Once you learn how to ride a bike, you always know how to ride a bike. He would call that inactive representation of knowledge. By 1 to 6, we're starting to move into iconic. It's about our senses and our sort of taking in of the senses. And then finally, we represent our knowledge symbolically around the age of 7, where we're able to use language or representations to represent thinking. And so that's what, and it's not just language, although language is important. You can also think about things like mathematic symbols. And so the symbolic representation is something that we develop at 7. Now, I'm going to share with you a video. I thought this was he was 99 years old. This was the week before he died, so I thought that was kind of cool when I saw that in the little description. But I'm going to let you listen to a little bit of what he says here.
I'm Jerome Bruner, and this man has come to interview me about what the effects of teaching are, what can teaching do for a learner, and I'm about to tell him that the main thing about teaching is that it opens up a wider range of possibility of what's possible. You teach them about something in the past or the present, but you hope that your teaching will have the good effect of leading them into the world of possibility. That's where intelligence lies. And you always, it's a risky kind of a business, because the fact of the matter is, when people tell you about to ask you about teaching and you say it's about the future, they'll say, oh, but that's too speculative. But that's what teaching should be for, to get you speculating about possibility. We mostly, particularly in the Western world, we like people to stick to the factual, to what goes on now. And I say the main object of teaching and educating is get them to think and share their notions about where this leads, to go beyond the information given.
So I'm going to stop there. I just thought I loved his idea there. I loved this, celebration of teaching as possibilities, and so you can see how Jerome Brunner really became such an important thinker when you think about what we consider constructivist learning theories and the role that project-based learning and inquiry-based learning and a lot of the things that are so important to our teaching practices today. Okay, so I'm sorry. I do not know why I can't get these out, so I'm sorry about that. Let me try over here so I can get this to go. No, bigger. Sorry, you're stuck with them. But Albert Bandura, then, so we had Jerome Brunner, who died in 2015, I believe it is. Albert Bandura is the one who follows in Brunner, and each of these they're building off of the other. And so Brunner was the one who really kind of named social learning theory, and social learning theory is what is the predicate for this course. And really, what he talks about is that we learn from others, that we learn through observation, through imitation, and through modeling. And those others can be texts and literature, but you may have heard he's very famous, the Bobo experiment. And this was an experiment where they put children into a room and they had a control group, and then they had two other groups that saw modeling of aggressive behavior against this clown doll. And then after that aggressive behavior of this clown doll, what they do is they put the child, after seeing that modeling of the aggression, they put the child into a room with the doll. And what they find is that the children that were exposed to the aggressive modeling, in fact, were more aggressive with the doll than those who were not. And so it was, really, this was sort of the foundational experiment that really solidified for us this idea of social learning, which is that the child really is influenced by a number of factors, and their learning and their knowledge is influenced by a number of ideas. And so cultural values, beliefs, and traditions, which Brunner would say are passed on through the language. Social interaction with parents, siblings, and teachers, which Bandura would talk about. He was talking about the modeling and the watching of others. And then language and communication skills, which Vygotsky helped us to understand is that there is a connection between language and communicating and our ability to think through and reason. So that's a brief, quick overview of social learning theory. And I just wanted to kind of go over some of what's going to be due. If you look, due dates will all be on Leo, but I wanted you to see some of the things that you're going to do. There's a poem called Where I'm From. This is a great poem to use as an introductory activity for your classes. Helps you to get to know something about your students, and it helps you to see, when you think about social learning, it helps you to see some of those cultural values and also some of those family influences. then I want you to kind of look at Lev Vygotsky because he is so important. I'm going to have you read a very simple article overview of him. And then there are 3 different articles, journal articles. You can read whichever one you choose, and you're going to look at why are Vygotsky's ideas still so important in the literacy classroom. Then I want you to post a response that quotes from the journal article from your reading and respond to at least 2 other classmates' posts. If possible, select a classmate who read one of the other articles so you can get some knowledge of some of the other articles that were available to you. I want you to read the class syllabus. I want you to ask any questions that you might have. And I will give you the cultural interview assignment, which will be due at the end of next class, so you get a chance to read it. I'm also going to upload the final assignment for this class because, it'll take you a couple of weeks into the class before you'll feel comfortable doing this assignment. But it's going to take some planning and gives you a chance to kind of start to ask people who might want to be in your group, okay? All right, so thank you very much, and please let me know if you have any questions. So we'll be in touch throughout this course.